Samuel was a man who had grown used to silence. He lived on a ranch that stretched for miles, where fields met the horizon and the sky seemed to go on forever. The nearest town was nearly an hour away by car, and most days he didn't bother driving there. His ranch had once been full of life. Years ago, his wife, Margaret, had filled the house with warmth, laughter, and the smell of fresh bread. Their children had run through the halls, filling the place with noise and energy. But time had taken all of that away. Margaret had passed quietly in her sleep more than 10 years ago, and his 2 sons had left for the city in search of jobs and lives that didn't include endless fields of grass and cattle. Now, Samuel was left with only his animals and the creak of old wooden beams to remind him that he was still alive. He was 68 years old, and though he was still strong enough to do most chores, his body ached in the mornings. His knees hurt when he walked too far, and his back complained whenever he lifted something heavy. Each morning he would pull on his boots, step outside, and breathe in the crisp air. The wind carried the smell of hay, soil, and sometimes rain. The sun rose slowly over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, but beauty did little to ease the weight of loneliness. Samuel often thought about the way people said that a man's ranch was his kingdom. Once he had believed that. Now he saw it more as a cage. The wide land trapped him in solitude. He had no one to share his meals with, no one to ask him how his day had gone. The walls of his home had become too quiet. At night, when he sat in his chair by the fire, the sound of the crackling wood was the only company he had. Sometimes he spoke aloud just to hear a voice, even if it was only his own. He had neighbors, yes, but they lived far. Occasionally one would stop by to borrow a tool or share news from town, but Samuel rarely welcomed them inside. He preferred to keep his distance. He didn't mean to be unfriendly. It was just that after so many years of silence, words felt heavy on his tongue. The conversations never lasted long, and as soon as the visitor left, the emptiness of the ranch seemed even louder than before. There were moments when Samuel wondered how his life had become this way. He had not planned to be alone. When he was younger, he dreamed of growing old with Margaret, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. He imagined evenings full of stories and laughter, holidays with a big table full of family. But life had decided otherwise. Now his sons called only once in a while, and though they cared, their voices were distant, busy with their own children and work. They rarely visited, and when they did, they seemed like guests in a house that no longer felt like theirs. Some nights Samuel sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the stars. The sky in the countryside was clear, filled with thousands of lights that city people rarely saw. He looked up and thought about how small he was compared to it all. He thought about Margaret, about how much he missed her, and about how strange it was to still be here when she was gone. He often whispered, "I'm still here, Maggie," still holding on. But in his heart, Samuel had accepted that he would probably die alone on this ranch. He had come to terms with it. He told himself that it wasn't so bad. At least he had his land, his animals, and the wide sky. At least he had memories. Yet no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, there was always a deep ache inside, a longing for connection, for someone to share his days with. One evening, after spending hours fixing a broken fence, Samuel came back to the house tired and sore. He warmed up a simple dinner, beans and bread, and ate in silence at the wooden table. The chair across from him sat empty, as it always did. He finished his meal slowly, listening to the ticking clock on the wall. Afterward, he went outside to make sure the barn was locked. The sky had turned gray, heavy clouds gathering. He knew a storm was coming. Back inside, he built a fire and settled into his chair. The rain began softly, tapping against the windows, then harder, drumming on the roof. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches. Thunder rolled across the land, and the house groaned with each strike of lightning. Samuel wasn't afraid of storms. He had lived through plenty. But storms always made him feel smaller, more aware of his isolation. There was no one to sit with him, no one to laugh nervously when thunder shook the windows. He was simply alone, as always. As the night deepened, Samuel thought he heard something unusual outside. At first, he dismissed it as the storm playing tricks. Perhaps a branch had fallen against the gate or the wind had knocked something loose. He shifted in his chair, ignoring it. But then, after another clap of thunder, he heard it again, steady, rhythmic knocking. It was faint but clear. Someone or something was at his gate. His first thought was of the cattle. Maybe one had broken free and was pushing against the wood. He pulled on his coat, grabbed his lantern, and stepped into the rain. The cold drops stung his face as he walked toward the gate. The lantern swung in his hand, casting shaky light on the mud. The knocking came again, louder this time. Samuel's heart beat faster. When he reached the gate, he froze. There, in the pouring rain, stood a girl. She was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes heavy with water. She looked no older than 16. In her hand was a small backpack, torn and worn, clutched tightly as if it held her whole life. Her lips trembled from the cold, and her eyes were wide with exhaustion and fear. Samuel stared at her, unable to speak for a moment. The storm roared around them, but all he could hear was her weak voice when she finally spoke. "Please, I had nowhere else to go." For a man who had spent years preparing to die alone, the sight of a stranger, a young, soaked girl at his gate, was something he could never have imagined. The rain was falling so hard that night it almost drowned out every sound, but Samuel could hear the girl's trembling voice as clear as day. He stood frozen, holding the lantern in one hand, watching her shiver at the gate. For years, Samuel had not expected anyone to come looking for him. His ranch was too far, too forgotten, and he had settled into the idea that he would live and die without surprises. But this was no ordinary evening. The storm had carried something unexpected to his doorstep. He pushed the gate open slowly, and the hinges creaked against the wind. The girl's thin shoulders jerked at the sound, as though she feared he might turn her away. Samuel didn't know what to say. He was a man of few words, and his voice felt rough after years of silence. But he managed to mutter, "Come on in before you freeze." She hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The mud squelched under her shoes as she followed him toward the house. The lantern light showed her face clearly now. She was pale, with wide eyes that darted around nervously. She held the torn backpack like it was her only treasure in the world. Samuel kept glancing at her as they walked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Once inside, he guided her toward the fire, which was still burning low in the hearth. The warmth filled the room, chasing away some of the chill. Samuel grabbed a towel from the closet and handed it to her. She clutched it, whispering a soft, "Thank you," before wrapping it tightly around herself. Her teeth chattered, and she tried to press closer to the flames. Samuel's mind spun with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she here on his ranch in the middle of a stormy night? But he didn't ask right away. He could see that she was too shaken to answer much. Instead, he went to the kitchen, heated up a pot of soup he had made earlier, and poured it into a bowl. When he placed it on the table in front of her, she looked at him with cautious gratitude. "Eat," he said simply. She obeyed, her hands trembling as she lifted the spoon. She ate quickly at first, as though afraid it might be taken away, but then slowed down once the warmth of the food spread through her. Samuel sat across the table, watching. He had grown used to silence at meals, but the presence of another person, especially this soaked and fragile girl, felt strange, almost unreal. After a while, Samuel cleared his throat. "What's your name?" The girl looked up from the soup, her voice quiet. "Emily, Emily," Samuel repeated, nodding slowly. "Where are you from?" She hesitated, glancing at the fire, then down at her backpack. "Not far, just far enough." It wasn't much of an answer, but Samuel didn't push. He had learned in life that sometimes silence spoke more than words. Whatever her story was, it wasn't one she was ready to share that night. Instead, he asked, "Do you have family?" Her lips tightened, and she shook her head quickly. "No, not really," that was all she said. Samuel leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't know what had brought her here, but he could see pain in her eyes, the kind of pain a child shouldn't have to carry. He decided not to ask more. Not yet. When she finished her soup, Samuel gave her a blanket and showed her to the spare room down the hall. It had once been his son's room long ago, but now it sat empty, covered in dust until Samuel quickly brushed it away. Emily looked at the small bed, the dresser, and the faded curtains. It wasn't much, but to her it seemed like a gift. "You can stay here tonight," Samuel said. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Her voice was soft, almost unsure. "Thank you." He nodded, pulling the door halfway shut before heading back to his own room. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the storm, Samuel's thoughts wouldn't rest. For years his life had been predictable, quiet, lonely, the same routine day after day. Now within just a few hours everything felt different. He had a stranger under his roof, a young girl who looked like she had been running from something. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just turn her away. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was washed clean, and the sun rose bright over the fields, turning the wet grass into a sea of sparkling green. Samuel woke early, as he always did, and went to check on the animals. He half expected Emily to still be sleeping. But when he returned to the house, she was already awake, sitting quietly at the table with her backpack beside her. "You don't have to leave yet," Samuel said, noticing how tightly she was holding her things. "There's chores to do if you want to stay busy." Emily looked surprised but nodded. "I can help." She followed him outside, and together they fed the chickens, tossed hay for the cattle, and checked the fence line. Samuel kept stealing glances at her. For someone so young, she worked with quiet determination, never complaining. She was small, but she carried buckets of water and scattered feed as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He realized then that this girl had learned to survive on her own for some time. During the day, she spoke little, but Samuel didn't mind. He wasn't much of a talker himself. Yet even in silence, there was something different about the ranch now. The place that had felt so empty for years seemed alive again. The clucking of chickens, the stamping of cattle, and the sound of another set of footsteps beside his own. It all blended into something almost like companionship. At lunch, Emily asked timidly, "Do you always live alone out here?" Samuel nodded. "Been that way a long time? Doesn't it get lonely?" she asked. Her question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years. He hesitated before answering. "Yes, it does." Emily looked down at her hands, quiet again. But Samuel noticed how her eyes softened, as if she understood more than she let on. For the first time in years, Samuel felt like someone truly saw him. Not just the old rancher with weathered hands, but the man who carried silence on his shoulders. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Samuel tried again to learn more about her. He asked where she had been heading when the storm caught her. Emily's voice shook slightly, but she told him she had been moving from place to place for months. She didn't go into detail, only that she had nowhere steady to stay. She had hoped to find shelter in town, but the storm forced her onto the road until she ended up at his gate. Samuel listened carefully, never interrupting. He didn't know the full story yet, but he sensed it was heavier than what she was ready to share. For now, it was enough that she had found his ranch. That night, Samuel thought again about how unusual life could be. One moment he had been sure he would spend the rest of his days alone, and the next he had a soaked girl sitting at his table, bringing warmth into a house that had been cold for too long. He didn't know what the future held for Emily or for himself, but he felt a strange certainty in his chest. Something had changed, and there was no going back. For the first time in many years, Samuel did not end the day in silence. He ended it with the faint sound of another voice lingering in the house, a reminder that perhaps his life was not as finished as he had once believed. The days that followed were unlike anything Samuel had experienced in years. He had grown so used to the quiet rhythm of his ranch that having Emily there changed everything. At first he thought it might feel strange or even burdensome to care for someone else after so long, but instead, it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Each morning he woke up and heard her moving around the kitchen or stepping outside to feed the chickens. Her footsteps were light but full of energy. It was a sound that made the old house feel alive again. When Samuel came into the kitchen one morning, he found her already preparing the coffee pot. She didn't know exactly how he liked it, but she had tried, and when he tasted it, he gave a small nod. She smiled shyly, proud that she had done something useful. The two of them fell into a rhythm quickly. They worked side by side, tending to the cattle, cleaning the stables, repairing fences, and carrying feed. Samuel was surprised at how quickly Emily picked things up. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, and she didn't shy away from hard work. Many people her age would have complained about the heat, the mud, or the smell, but Emily never did. She worked quietly, her eyes focused, as if she had been waiting her whole life for someone to let her be part of something. In the evenings, they shared meals together at the same table where Samuel had spent years eating alone. At first, the conversations were short and hesitant. Emily didn't say much, and Samuel wasn't sure what to ask. But slowly the words began to flow more naturally. She asked him about the animals, about how long he had lived on the ranch, about his favorite seasons. He answered in his plain, straightforward way. But inside he found himself enjoying her curiosity. One night, while they sat by the fire after supper, Emily held her small backpack on her lap and carefully unzipped it. From inside she pulled out a sketchbook. She hesitated before opening it, as though she wasn't sure if she should share. Finally she turned it toward Samuel. The pages were filled with drawings, landscapes, animals, and faces sketched in pencil. Some were rough, others surprisingly detailed. Samuel leaned closer, impressed by the careful lines and the way she captured life on the page. "You drew these?" he asked. She nodded, almost embarrassed. "It's just something I do. It helps me forget." Samuel didn't press her about what she wanted to forget. He simply said, "You're good at it." Her eyes lit up at his words, and for a brief moment, Samuel saw the child she still was beneath the layer of sadness she carried. Over the next few days, Emily began sketching things around the ranch. She drew the horses in the pasture, the chickens scratching the dirt, even Samuel himself while he worked near the barn. At first he grumbled when he noticed her watching him with her pencil in hand, but secretly he felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He realized she wasn't just drawing him, she was seeing him. One evening, after a long day of work, Samuel and Emily sat down to dinner. As they ate, she finally opened up a little more about her life. Her voice was soft but steady. "I've been in foster care most of my life," she said, looking down at her plate. "Different homes, different people. Some were okay, some weren't, but none of them ever really wanted me. I was just there." Samuel listened without interrupting. He could feel the weight of her words. "I left the last place a while ago," she continued. "I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I thought maybe I'd find somewhere I belonged." Her voice cracked a little at the end, but she didn't cry. Samuel sat quietly for a long time, his heart heavy. He didn't know what to say. He had never been good with comforting words, but finally he said, "You belong here for as long as you need." Emily looked up at him, surprised, as if she hadn't expected kindness. Her lips formed a small smile, and Samuel knew that in that moment something had shifted. The ranch began to feel different. Where once it had been filled only with the sound of wind and animals, now there was laughter. Emily laughed at the chickens chasing each other around the yard, at the horse that sneezed in her hair, at Samuel when he muttered about stubborn fences. Samuel found himself smiling more, though he tried not to show it too much. It felt unfamiliar, but good. Even the neighbors noticed the change. One of them, an older woman named Mrs. Clark, stopped by one afternoon to drop off some fresh bread. She was surprised to see Emily helping Samuel carry wood. "Well, look at that," Mrs. Clark said kindly. "I haven't seen your place this lively in years." Samuel only shrugged, but inside he knew she was right. At night, Samuel often sat in his chair by the fire, watching Emily sketch or reading one of the few books he kept on the shelf. He thought about how strange life was. He had believed his story was almost over, that he had nothing left but quiet days and a lonely end. And yet here was this girl sitting by his fire, bringing color back into a life that had been gray for too long. He wondered what Margaret would think if she were here. He imagined her smile, her gentle words. He thought she would be glad that he had opened his door, glad that he hadn't let loneliness turn him cold. He whispered sometimes into the night, "She's safe here, Maggie. I'll take care of her." But deep down, Samuel also worried. He knew life wasn't simple. A girl showing up in the middle of a storm didn't happen without reason. He didn't know who might be looking for her, or what she might be running from. Still, he decided he would deal with that when the time came. For now, she was here, and she was safe. As the days turned into weeks, Emily settled into the rhythm of the ranch as if she had always belonged there. She learned how to saddle a horse, how to mend a fence, and how to tell when the cattle needed to be moved to fresh grass. She was eager to learn, and Samuel found himself teaching her patiently. It reminded him of teaching his own sons when they were young before they grew up and left. One morning, while they were fixing a broken section of the barn roof, Emily laughed and said, "I never thought I'd like working so much." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not about liking it. It's about doing what needs to be done." She grinned at him. "Maybe, but it feels good too, like I'm part of something." Her words stayed with Samuel long after that. Being part of something, that was what he had been missing too. And now somehow this girl had given it back to him. That night, as he lay in bed, Samuel thought again about how much had changed. The house no longer felt empty. The land no longer felt like a cage. For the first time in years, he looked toward tomorrow with something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Weeks passed, and what had once felt like an accident of fate began to feel more like routine. Samuel and Emily worked side by side every day, and though their lives were simple, there was something rich in the quiet rhythm they shared. The ranch had come alive again with laughter, footsteps, and the soft hum of conversations in the evenings. For Samuel, it was as though time had rewound, giving him a chance to feel connected again. Still, Samuel knew he could not avoid the truth forever. Emily was young, far too young to be out in the world alone. The storm had brought her to his gate, but storms passed and questions remained. Who was she really? What had driven her into the night with only a torn backpack? And most importantly, was she safe? One evening, as the sun melted into the hills and painted the sky pink and gold, Samuel sat on the porch while Emily sketched in her book. He had been thinking for days about how to ask her more, not out of nosiness, but because he cared. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Emily, can I ask you something?" She looked up, cautious. "Sure. You said before that you didn't really have family, but someone must be responsible for you. You're too young to be out here alone." Emily's pencil stopped moving. She stared at the page for a long time before answering. Her voice was steady, though her eyes shimmered with something unspoken. "I was in foster care. I've been in so many houses I can't even count anymore. Some people were kind, but most didn't want me. I always felt like I was just in the way. Like extra baggage." Samuel's chest tightened. He had lived long enough to know loneliness, but the thought of a child carrying it so young cut deep. He wanted to say something comforting, but he had never been good with words. All he managed was, "I'm sorry you went through that." Emily shrugged, though her small smile showed she appreciated his response. "I left. I thought I'd be better off finding my own way. But I didn't really have a plan. Then the storm came and I ended up here." She paused, closing her sketchbook. "It feels like I was supposed to find this place." Samuel leaned back in his chair, gazing at the wide field stretching out before them. "Maybe you were." But that night, when Emily went to bed, Samuel stayed awake by the fire. He knew the right thing to do would be to let the authorities know about her. She was a minor, and the law was clear. Yet his heart ached at the thought of her being taken away, sent back to a system that had failed her over and over. He thought of his late wife, Margaret, and imagined what she might say. He knew she would remind him to do what was right, but also to do what was kind. The next morning, Samuel drove into town. He hadn't told Emily where he was going, only that he had errands. At the sheriff's office, he found Sheriff Collins, a man he had known for decades. The sheriff looked surprised when Samuel explained. "A girl showed up at your ranch? In the middle of the storm?" Collins scratched his chin thoughtfully. "That's unusual, Sam, real unusual." Samuel nodded. "She calls herself Emily. She says she's been in foster care. She's a good kid, Sheriff. Works hard, doesn't complain, but she looks like she's been through a lot." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "You know, I have to check into this. If she's a runaway, the system will want her back." Samuel's jaw tightened. "And what happens then? She goes back to bouncing between houses, feeling unwanted? She's finally safe. She's finally got a home, even if it's temporary." Collins studied him carefully. "You've grown attached, haven't you?" Samuel didn't answer, but his silence was enough. The sheriff sighed. "All right, here's what I'll do. I'll look into her file. But I won't come barging in and take her. Not unless there's danger. You just keep her safe for now." Samuel felt relief wash over him. "Thank you." Back at the ranch, Emily was in the yard feeding the chickens when Samuel returned. She ran to help him unload supplies, acting as though nothing had changed. Samuel didn't tell her about his visit to the sheriff. He figured there would be time for that later. For now, he just wanted her to feel secure. Over the next few weeks, Emily seemed to blossom. She laughed more freely, asked Samuel endless questions about ranch life, and even sang softly while she worked. She rode the horses with surprising grace and discovered a love for baking, often filling the kitchen with the sweet smell of bread or pies. The house that had been silent for so many years now felt like a home again. One evening, Emily sat at the table, her sketchbook open. She showed Samuel a drawing she had done of the ranch, the barn, the fields, the horses, even Samuel himself standing tall by the fence. He studied it, touched by the detail. She had captured not only the land, but the feeling of belonging that had grown between them. "It's beautiful," Samuel said quietly. Emily smiled. It's the first place I've drawn that feels like mine. Those words struck Samuel deeply. She had called the ranch hers, and in a way it was. It wasn't just his anymore, it belonged to both of them now. Yet Samuel's worry lingered. He knew the sheriff would eventually come back with answers. He didn't know if Emily would be allowed to stay, and the thought of losing her weighed heavily on him. Still, he tried not to let it show. Instead, he focused on each day, on each shared laugh and simple meal, as though they were treasures to be stored away in his heart. The bond between them grew stronger. One morning, Emily looked up at him after they finished fixing a section of the fence and said, "You remind me of what a dad should be." Samuel's throat tightened, and he had to look away to hide the emotion in his eyes. He hadn't expected to be called anything close to that again. His sons were grown, and though he loved them, distance had built walls between them. Hearing Emily's words was like a gift he never knew he needed. He simply said, "And you remind me what it feels like to have family again." That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Samuel sat on the porch with Emily beside him. The crickets sang, the air was cool, and for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel the emptiness of the land. He felt peace, as though life had given him back something precious he thought was gone forever. Still, deep in his heart, he knew the world outside the ranch would eventually come knocking. And when it did, he could only hope it wouldn't take away the girl who had brought light back into his lonely life. The weeks rolled into months, and the once lonely ranch began to change in ways Samuel never thought possible. The animals seemed livelier, the fields looked brighter, and the house no longer felt like a hollow shell of memories. Every corner of it now carried signs of life again. Emily's drawings pinned near the fireplace, the smell of bread baking in the oven, her laughter echoing in the halls where silence used to weigh heavy. For a man who had resigned himself to die alone, Samuel found himself waking each day with something close to joy, but he also knew that nothing in life stayed untouched forever. Sheriff Collins came by one afternoon, his truck pulling into the dusty yard. Samuel had been repairing a section of the barn roof, while Emily brushed one of the horses nearby. She froze when she saw the sheriff step out, her hand tightening around the brush. Fear flickered in her eyes, and Samuel's heart clenched. "It's all right," he said gently, climbing down the ladder. "He's just here to talk." Collins tipped his hat and gave a small smile to Emily, though his eyes were full of the weight of his duty. "Afternoon, Sam, Emily." Samuel motioned toward the porch. "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Emily had first eaten a bowl of soup months ago. The sheriff cleared his throat. "I looked into her background," he began carefully. "Emily's been in the foster system a long time. She's right about moving from house to house. No stable family. She's listed as a runaway, but the truth is, no one's really been looking for her. There's no parents waiting, no guardians calling, just a file in a cabinet." Emily kept her eyes on the table, her hands gripping her sketchbook. Collins sighed. "Now, the law says she should be placed back into the system. But I also know the system doesn't always do what's best for the child." He looked at Samuel. "If you're willing, there's a process. It's not quick, and it's not simple, but you could apply to be her guardian. At least then she'd stay here in a place where she's safe." Samuel's breath caught in his chest. He glanced at Emily, who looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. He thought of his wife, of the empty years, of the way this girl had brought life back to his home. There was no hesitation in his heart. "I'll do it," Samuel said firmly. "Whatever it takes," the sheriff nodded. "I figured you might say that. I'll start the paperwork." Emily's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hide them with a quick smile. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, the ranch felt different again, not just alive, but secure. Emily sat by the fire, sketching Samuel's old boots by the hearth, while Samuel watched her quietly. He thought about the road ahead, the forms, the questions, the visits from officials. It wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in years, he felt like his life had direction again. Over the following weeks, the process began. A social worker came to the ranch to see how Emily was living. She walked through the house, asked questions, and even stayed long enough to watch Emily help Samuel with the evening chores. Emily smiled proudly as she showed the woman her drawings of the ranch and explained how she fed the chickens each morning. The social worker nodded with approval. "She seems happy here," she said softly to Samuel. "She is," Samuel replied. "And so am I." Days turned into weeks, and slowly the pieces fell into place. The paperwork was signed, the visits completed, And one morning Samuel received the letter confirming what he had hoped for. He was now Emily's legal guardian. The moment he read the words, his hands trembled. He handed the paper to Emily, who gasped and hugged him tightly. "You're stuck with me now," Samuel said with a chuckle, though his voice cracked with emotion. Emily laughed through her tears. "I wouldn't want it any other way." From that day forward, the ranch was no longer Samuel's alone. It was theirs. They planted a small garden together behind the house, with Emily carefully sketching the layout before they dug the soil. They rode horses side by side across the fields, Samuel teaching her the names of every ridge and creek. In the evenings, they cooked meals together, Emily adding her own touches to the recipes Samuel had made for years. One summer evening, after a long day of work, Samuel sat on the porch while Emily sketched the sunset. The sky blazed with colors, orange, pink, and purple melting together. Emily looked up from her paper and said, "Do you ever think about how different life would be if I hadn't knocked on your gate that night?" Samuel nodded slowly, "All the time. And every time I think about it, I thank God that you did." Emily smiled, her eyes glowing in the fading light. "Me too." The seasons passed, and with each one, the bond between them deepened. Samuel was no longer the lonely rancher waiting for his days to end. He was a father again, guiding, teaching, and protecting. Emily was no longer the runaway with nothing but a torn backpack. She was a daughter, a dreamer, and a part of a family she thought she would never find. Neighbors began to notice the change even more. Mrs. Clark stopped by one afternoon with a pie and said, "I've never seen you look this alive, Sam. That girl brought the spring back to this place." Samuel simply smiled, knowing it was true. As years passed, the ranch grew stronger. Emily's drawings filled the walls, turning the house into a gallery of their life together. She sketched the first calf she helped deliver, the harvest of their garden, and even Samuel's face, lined with age but softened by happiness. Her art told the story of a girl who had found home and a man who had found family again. On his 69th birthday, Samuel sat at the table with a cake Emily had baked herself. She had decorated it with clumsy frosting letters that read, "Happy birthday, Dad." Samuel stared at the word Dad for a long time before blowing out the candles. It wasn't just a title. It was a gift, one he never thought he would receive again. That night, after the fire burned low and Emily had gone to bed, Samuel sat in his chair and thought about the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the storm, the soaked girl at his gate, the uncertainty, the fear. And he remembered the choice he had made to open the door, to let her in. It had been the simplest decision, yet it had changed everything. He whispered softly into the quiet room, as though Margaret could still hear him. "I'm not alone anymore, Maggie. She's here. She's family." And with that, Samuel leaned back, peace settling deep in his heart. The lonely rancher who once thought he would die alone had discovered something far greater. Life had given him a second chance, and he had taken it. The ranch was no longer a cage of silence. It was a home, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow.